The forest seemed alive under the weight of the moonlight. Tall pine trees stretched endlessly, their spindly branches scratching against the darkened sky. My flashlight beam barely pierced the oppressive darkness as Ethan and I trudged through the dense woods. We were lost, and somehow the trail map was gone from my backpack. "This shouldn't be possible," Ethan muttered, shivering despite the unseasonably warm night. "Calm down," I said, though my voice betrayed my unease. "We'll find our way out." We had ventured into Whispering Pines, a forest infamous in local folklore. Stories of distorted voices, vanishing paths, and a peculiar sense of being watched were common. I'd dismissed them as silly superstition, but Ethan had hesitated when I suggested exploring. Now I could feel his earlier reluctance eating away at both of us. A soft rustling broke through the quiet. It wasn't the wind. The air was still. We both froze, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. "Probably just an animal," I whispered, my fingers tightening on the flashlight. "Yeah," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. We kept moving, but the rustling seemed to follow us, always just out of sight. The further we walked, the stranger the forest became. Trees twisted unnaturally, their trunks contorting as if writhing in pain. A low hum vibrated through the air, just beneath the threshold of hearing. Ethan stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" I asked, looking around. "The humming. It's like—" He trailed off, tilting his head. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and went out. "Damn it," he muttered, smacking it against his palm. My light wavered too, but didn't go out. "Let's keep moving. We can't just stand here." We pressed on. Our steps hurried. The hum grew louder, becoming an indistinct murmuring that seemed to echo from everywhere. I glanced at Ethan and saw the terror in his eyes. A loud crack split the air, like a tree snapping in half. We turned toward the sound and saw a figure standing among the trees. It was indistinct, more shadow than human. The figure didn't move, but something about its presence felt profoundly wrong. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Ethan's arm. We bolted through the trees, our breathing ragged. The murmuring followed, growing louder with each step. Ethan stumbled and I hauled him up, adrenaline driving me forward. We burst into a small clearing and stopped, gasping for air. "What was that?" Ethan panted, looking back toward the dark trees. I shook my head. "I don't know, but we can't—" My words faltered as I noticed the clearing's center. A large stone stood there, covered in strange carvings. The murmuring intensified, now resembling whispers in a language I couldn't recognize. The air grew icy and my breath turned to mist. Ethan's flashlight sputtered back to life, its beam illuminating the stone. Dark, sticky trails ran down its surface, and the carvings seemed to shift under the light. A low, guttural growl came from behind us. "Don't turn around," I whispered, my voice trembling. But Ethan couldn't resist. He turned and his scream shattered the night. I spun around and saw the figure again, now fully formed. It was tall and gaunt, its face a void of shifting shadows. It reached out a skeletal hand, and the forest erupted in chaos. Trees swayed violently without wind, the whispers rising to deafening screams. I grabbed Ethan's hand and pulled him toward the stone. The ground beneath us seemed to writhe, roots curling up to trip us. As we reached the stone, a blinding light exploded from its carvings, and the figure let out a horrific shriek, recoiling. Everything went silent. We found ourselves back at the trailhead, the forest's edge looming behind us. The moon was gone, replaced by the faint light of dawn. We stared at each other, trying to process what had happened. "Was that real?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't. In my pocket, I felt something cold. I pulled it out and froze. It was a small, intricately carved stone, the same symbols etched into its surface as those we'd seen in the forest. The whispers began again, faint but unmistakable. And they weren't coming from the forest. They were coming from the stone. It started with a strange Christmas gift from my coworker, Jessica, a white noise machine. "It's great for sleeping," she told me. "Blocks out everything. She didn't know I lived alone in the middle of nowhere. I tried it that night. The soft hum of static filled the room, oddly calming, like a warm blanket of sound. For the first time in months, I fell asleep quickly. At 3:07 a.m., I woke up to a faint whisper behind the noise. I turned the machine off. Silence. My heartbeat pounded louder than the void surrounding me. It must have been my imagination. I turned the machine back on and forced myself back to sleep. Over the next week, the whispers became more distinct. Fragments of sentences, like someone just out of reach, speaking in a foreign, warbled language. Sometimes, I thought I heard my name. Ben, hear this? One night, I recorded the sound with my phone. Playing it back in the morning, I swear I could make out a faint voice saying, "Don't let it in." Who or what was it? Out of curiosity and dread, I decided to dig into where Jessica had bought the machine. She said it came from a local thrift store. When I called, the woman on the other end seemed reluctant to talk. "You have one of those?" she asked sharply. "Yeah, why?" She hesitated before saying, "I think that was Mrs. Gerald's. She swore it helped her talk to things." Things? The line went dead. That night I unplugged the machine and shoved it into the closet, but the noise came back, louder. No machine, no speakers, just emanating from the walls. The voices weren't whispers anymore. They screamed, urgent and pleading, "Do not let it in!" My lights flickered, my breath fogged, and the temperature plummeted. The shadows in my room weren't still anymore. They rippled and twitched unnaturally, inching toward me. And then I heard it, knocking, from inside the walls. I bolted out of the house with nothing but my phone and the clothes on my back. From the street, I watched as the lights in every window blinked rhythmically, one at a time, like the house itself was alive. I moved out the next day. Weeks later, Jessica texted me. "Found something cool. Another thrift store white noise machine. Want it?" I never replied. For months, I avoided anything remotely resembling white noise. No static on the TV, no calming nature tracks. Even heavy rain made my stomach churn. But then, 2 nights ago, it started again. Not from a machine, not even from within the walls. The sound came from me. I woke to a deep hum vibrating through my chest. A low, droning static emanated from my own body. When I spoke aloud to test my voice, the words crackled, distorted, as if they were being filtered through the same oppressive noise. Panic set in fast. I couldn't stay home. It didn't feel safe. I drove aimlessly, the droning hum in my chest intensifying with every passing mile. A relentless vibration clawed its way through my ribs as if my body had become a tuning fork. Then, on the edge of a dark country road, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. A hollow, crackling voice filled the receiver. It wasn't entirely human. "Ben, you let it out." My voice broke as I whispered, "What? What did I let out?" "They're coming." By the time the first figure appeared in the rearview mirror, I'd driven almost 50 miles, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. At first glance, it looked human, just standing in the middle of the darkened road. But its form didn't stay consistent. Limbs twisted unnaturally, bones elongated and contracted like they couldn't decide what they wanted to be. As I passed it, I realized there was no face, just a smooth, pale surface. I didn't stop driving. More figures appeared on the side of the road, their distorted forms writhing in place. By the time I saw the 5th one, I realized they weren't trying to stop me. They were following me. Now I'm hiding out in a motel, the white noise of the old TV blaring unintentionally. Every shadow in the room feels like it's watching, waiting. The static is louder than ever, not just around me, but within me, coursing through my veins, beating in my heart. I haven't slept in 48 hours, afraid of what might happen if I do. My phone buzzed again a few minutes ago. This time it was Jessica. She only sent 2 words. "I'm sorry." I texted back, demanding answers. But before I could send another, I heard something. Something worse than the whispers, the screams, the knocking. A knock. Not at the door. Not from the walls. It came from inside the TV. I've stayed in countless hotels for work, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened at the Larchmont Hotel. The conference in the city had stretched later than expected, and by the time I reached the desk to check in, it was nearly midnight. The receptionist looked drained but flashed me a polite smile. "Room 616, she said, sliding over the key. Her hand lingered a moment, her smile faltering as if she wanted to say something more, but she stayed silent. The elevator ride to the 6th floor was eerily quiet. The walls were lined with ornate mirrors, slightly distorted, casting off reflections that looked wrong. As the elevator dinged, I swear I heard a faint sigh, as though someone had just whispered near my ear. Brushing it off as exhaustion, I headed down the hall. Room 616 was at the very end of the corridor. The numbers on the other rooms were scratched and faded, but this door was pristine, the brass numbers gleaming unnaturally bright. The key fit with an audible click, and the door creaked open. The room smelled faintly of old wood and lavender. It wasn't the worst hotel room I'd seen. Plush carpeting, dim yellow lighting, and a painting of an empty forest hanging above the bed. What struck me was the large antique mirror above the desk, positioned to face the bed. Its dark, cloudy glass seemed too ancient for the otherwise modern furnishings. Shrugging off my unease, I collapsed onto the bed, flipping on the TV for noise. The channels were nothing but static. Every one. It felt strange, but I convinced myself it was just bad reception. As I turned the TV off, something reflected in the mirror caught my eye. There was movement. It was faint, like a shadow darting behind me. I turned sharply. Nothing. The unease was growing heavier, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. Crawling into bed, I closed my eyes and willed myself to sleep. I woke at 3:16 a.m. to the sound of whispering. It was coming from the mirror. I stared at it, my breath frozen in my chest. The surface of the glass seemed darker than before, like smoke swirling beneath it. Shapes began to emerge, faint at first, but then clearer. Faces, distorted and anguished, pressing against the inside of the mirror as though desperate to get out. And then I heard it. A knock. Not at the door, but from the mirror itself. I scrambled out of bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. My first instinct was to cover the mirror, but as I moved closer, my reflection didn't follow. Instead, it stared straight ahead, its eyes locked onto mine with an unnatural intensity. Then it smiled. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my phone to call the front desk. The receptionist answered, her voice shaky. "You're in room 616? She asked. "Yes, there's something wrong with the mirror," I stammered. She let out a long, shaky breath before whispering, "Get out of that room, now." I didn't wait to ask questions. Grabbing my bag, I bolted for the door. As I reached for the handle, the mirror shattered. A deafening sound filled the room, a mix of static and screams, piercing and endless. Shards of glass flew outward, but instead of hitting the floor, they hung in the air, twisting and writhing like something alive. And then, from within the shattered frame, it crawled out. It was humanoid, but wrong in every sense. Its limbs moved too fluidly, bending in unnatural angles. The face, or what resembled a face, was a patchwork of the reflections I had seen earlier, stitched together in a grotesque mockery of a human form. I flung the door open and sprinted down the hall. Behind me, I could hear it chasing, its distorted limbs scraping against the walls and floor. My feet barely touched the ground as I reached the elevator, frantically slamming the button for the lobby. The doors closed just as the creature reached the elevator, its hand, if you could call it that, scraping against the metal. As the elevator descended, I could hear it screaming, a sound I'll never forget. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Peeling out of the parking lot, I looked back at the hotel. Every single window on the 6th floor was lit, with shadows of figures standing perfectly still, watching me leave. When I returned the next morning to report what happened, the building manager gave me a confused look. "The Larchmont doesn't have a 6th floor," he said. My heart stopped. But as he continued explaining, my eyes caught the brass room key still sitting on the passenger seat. The engraved numbers gleamed, 616,